All right, so today we are going to start on long-term economic growth. So we think back, this is kind of a static relationship here of the flow of the market system. Let me go back to this one where we left off last week measuring dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries, the spending done on that stuff. What did we call that? GDP, gross domestic product, right? So that's one of our three biggies that we have. So what we're hoping is that our politicians, especially coming into this election cycle, regardless of their political affiliation, are kind of keeping the three biggies in macro. Because some of what they do affect the three biggies. So number one is our income. So GDP, remember we learned last time, is basically our national income. If we add up everybody's income together, that is GDP. So how are we doing as a nation in terms of our income? And today what we're going to do is a little bit on income per person. So per capita GDP. So GDP, we're going to also use the abbreviation Y. So Y usually stands for income, but since GDP equals income, so we'll kind of use that. So today, in this chapter, for that matter, chapter 23, we're going to be looking at per capita income. So, which I'm going to call YPC for shorthand, per capita income. What does per capita mean?
Per person.
Per person. So what we're going to do is basically just take, the income per person equals GDP, or our income, divided by the population. And so that's kind of a handy statistic to kind of start to compare incomes per person in different countries. And why are some countries have more income per person? Why do some countries have less? Different countries have different policies. So China, a more communist type system, has different policies in place. How are their people doing relative to our people under a more communist, centrally planned type of system? Okay, so that's three biggies. GDP and income is one of them. What's the other one we learned about this last chapter on how to measure? The CPI. So CPI was helping to measure, what was it measuring? Not costs, but prices. What do we call it? What's the I word? Inflation. So inflation is the other biggie. Another biggie, I should say, which I'm using the notation pi. Sorry, this is the inflation rate. Remember, it was the rate of change of the CPI, for example. If it went from 100 to 105, there was 5% inflation. So you guys had a lot of homework problems and other exercises related to how prices are changing. Some of those measures do measure costs. So we have like the wholesale price index. You can make those indices for anything. So, but in general, we want to keep thinking about inflation, our prices rising. Kind of the key takeaway with that is that if our income stays constant but prices go up, are we better off or worse off? If my income stays constant, just think of you personally. So the amount of money you're making stays constant, but prices go up. Am I better off or worse off as a human being?
Worse off.
Worse off, right? Because if I go shopping, my shopping cart, I can't put as much stuff this year than I did last year. So the amount of stuff in my shopping cart is what puts a smile on my face, right? In terms of the material well-being of that. That's only one part of the human flourishing complexity, but certainly having more material things rather than less material things tends to put a little bit more happiness in our belly. Oh, Russ, money can't buy happiness. Money's not the only thing in life. Totally agree. Totally agree. But the data supports that higher income people do tend to be happy in terms of self-reported happiness. I'm talking about data now. I'm not talking about my gut feeling. But the old thing of money can't buy you happiness. It turns out it can. It can buy you some happiness. According to data on self-reported happiness, higher income people tend to. Now, do we all know the story of the high income person that's miserable? Of course, right? But that's not what's happening in general on average. So that's giving us kind of some credence on this stuff, on why it's important to look at. So for inflation, let's just put a little note here. Note, if income stays constant and there's an increase in inflation, we are worse off. So that's kind of the connection between number one and number two of why they're two very important things. GDP up here was corrected for inflation. So let's go, if you haven't done so, add the R in front of GDP, because it's real GDP that we care about. Real GDP adjusted for inflation. So in some sense, what we've got going on here is that number one talks about the quantity of goods and services. Number two is thinking about the prices of goods and services, right? That's why it's so important that together those things make up a large part of the day-to-day stuff that we do in the real world. Okay, questions on those two? I said it's the three biggies. Which one's the last one that we just got out of in this last chapter? We got one missing off the list here. We got GDP, real GDP, we got inflation, unemployment. What's the other one we spent a lot of time on? So number 3 is unemployment. You can't buy much stuff if you don't have a job, right? So this one ends up being pretty important. So we have lots of different ways of measuring employment. We learned that not everybody who's not working is unemployed, so we have kind of a specific definition. What was the key thing? If you're unemployed, how do you get that distinction? What must you need to be doing? You're not working and you're looking. So you're not working, but you're looking. You want a job, right? So that was our category of unemployment. And so we're doing pretty good on that. We want more people employed as opposed to less, but do we want 0? Is our target 0 unemployment? No. Why? What sorts of things might we expect in a healthy, vibrant, growing economy? What type of unemployment would we expect?
People leaving jobs for better jobs?
Yeah, leaving jobs for a better job. Good. That was one of them. What else was a healthy one for unemployment? So that was what was that called, by the way, the job turnover one? Frictional. Frictional unemployment was good, or expected anyway. Again, it might suck for the new college graduate who hasn't found a job yet. They're feeling anxious. They're not sleeping well at night because they don't have, I get it. That kind of sucks to be unemployed. But in terms of the economy, we expect a healthy, dynamic economy that's looking for new things and it's growing. Some industries are emerging, some are declining. We expect there to be some frictional unemployment. That's a good sign of an economy, that there's some normal churning of the labor market. What was the other type of unemployment? Yeah?
Structural.
Structural. Okay, what was structural?
Technology.
Mismatch between
Technology and skills.
Technology and skills, or the current state of the economy and your particular skills. So your skills become obsolete. And so now you're no longer quite fitting in with the demand for the types of stuff these guys want to buy, right? So what these guys need to be making to make money, your skills no longer fit. And so structural unemployment, again, might suck for the person who lost their job because their industry's declining. but hopefully they can go get retrained into something else in maybe another emerging area. All right, so that's the three biggies that we hope our leaders and policymakers at the local, state, and national level are kind of thinking about. I am testifying Thursday morning to the Kansas State Senate Commerce Committee. First time I've ever done this. And I'm going to do a little 10 to 15 minutes. And the theme is barriers to economic growth in Kansas. So I'm going to spend 10 to 15 minutes. I'll let you guys know how it all goes. But it's all new to me. I'm going to just give 10 to 15 minutes to policymakers to say, hey, I think Kansas maybe should do a little bit of this or that. I haven't even quite prepared it yet, so I'm not sure what I'm going to say. I was working on it this morning a little bit. But I'm going to figure out something to say of what we're doing in this class, and I can assure you that it's related to what we're covering in this chapter, in this material. Okay, so here's the thing for policymakers. In general, just so that you guys have it on your minds, we want this variable going up or down. Policymakers, we want this one going up or down? Up, right? So increasing economic growth, are we doing things to hopefully help stimulate economic growth? Prices. What do we want prices to be doing? Remaining constant is probably the best state. Do we want like a constant rate of 20% inflation? No, that would probably be too high. So I like to think of low and stable. Stable with a lot of emphasis on the stable part, but low and stable would probably be some of our policy objectives. So with real GDP, we'd like to see this thing increasing. So we have some economic growth. Sometimes if it's increasing too fast, that could be an issue, but long term, we'd like to see incomes going up. We'd like to see prices low and stable. Low and stable. And then unemployment. What's our objective there? Get cyclical to zero. So if we only have structural and frictional unemployment, which were the healthy ones, we put a special word on there. What was it called? The natural rate. Good. So for the unemployment rate, we pretty much want it kind of low in general, if we wanted to say low. So at natural rate, at the natural rate of unemployment, which I call UN, U subscript N, the natural rate of unemployment. And then just as a reminder, this has frictional plus structural unemployment. So we got frictional and structural unemployment. Those are the ones that we expect in a healthy economy. So that's what we're looking for. The natural rate, prices being low and stable, economic growth occurring. If a politician hits all three of these, they pretty much haven't lost office. We'll see if Donald Trump does that. He's doing all three of those right now. But we all know his situation, right? It could be a little volatile. But there's never been a president who's had really a good economy that hasn't gotten reelected. Because these are important. I mean, we've got real human beings like you and I that have more jobs that didn't have jobs years ago, right? Because what's our unemployment rate? 3.5%. Historical lows, all kinds of demographics, women, blacks, Latinos, across the board. Everybody's enjoying some historic lows of unemployment. Prices are pretty stable. We're going to learn that's less Trump than more of the central bank. But low and stable prices, our Federal Reserve has been doing pretty good with that, and we've seen some increasing GDP. So we'll see what happens as we roll in and kind of learn more about this policy stuff. But those are the things that we hope politicians at the local, state, and national level are keeping in mind when they're convening on different things. Okay, so questions or comments there? So let me show you some data around the world. There's a bit of a interesting facts. So interesting facts over the last 50, 60 years, because this chapter is really looking at long-term growth. And the question that was out there is, we've got countries, we're going to look at per capita income. So for the, so per capita income, and then we're going to look at the USA here. And I've got some little bit older data, but we're doing such a long run of it. This is when some of this started to get interesting. And think about where countries were back in the old days and the new days, so to speak. So here's what per capita income. In fact, let me switch these columns on you. This was from the 1960s, and this is per capita income in 2009. So back in the 1960s, we had the United States at like $37,000 per year. And in 2009, 46,000. And we mentioned before, that was nominal GDP at the $63,000 level. So we've grown since then as well. So over time, what has happened to these countries? So around the globe, we've got Hong Kong and Japan. Hong Kong, Japan, just kind of lumping them together now, roughly at 46,000 today. And then we've got kind of the European countries, France, Germany, so France / Germany / Italy, kind of UK, kind of all the big EU type countries. In this time frame, we're at like 32,000. And then we've got Central Europe, so kind of former Soviet Union, which you guys might not have studied very much of, which is fine, kind of Central Europe that used to be under control, the Eastern Bloc countries. Lithuania, all the ones that kind of border Russia that were occupied, they're all right around 18,000. So already you can start to see some striking differences here. So we've got places over in Europe that are less than half of where we were in the United States, right? You start to wonder, well, wow, who's older, Europe or us? Europe, quite a bit older, right? How old are we in the United States? 200 and some years, 1776, right? We can kind of date back to different times when our, so Europe, of course, has been around for, thousands of years. So we can get up to a few thousand years easily dating back some things. It's like, so should they have something on us in terms of income, right? So, but that's the type of stuff we see. Then we can go travel down to Central and South America and also mainland China, Central and South America and China, and you're down in this, 8 to 11,000 range. And then you've got Africa. So Africa, around the 2000 range. So economists kind of look at this and say, well, this is almost crazy, right? How do we have these income differences around the globe? And so Adam Smith, his most famous book in 1776 was The Nature and Causes of a Wealth of Nations. Why do some nations have so much money? Are they just smarter? Did they figure something out? Did they have a lot of oil reserves? Did lots of natural resources, you know, the land of plenty? You know, what's kind of the secret sauce to getting this dynamic? Well, part of that mystery was figured out when we go back to the 1960s. Hong Kong and Japan were down here. So back in the day, these guys were in this 8 to 11 range. And so it allowed economists to go back and say, oh, well, how did they do so well? How did they jump up to here in as little as, it turned out to be like 40 years, they were making really big progress, kind of catching up to the United States. You know, what did they do differently than anything that went on in Central and South America and China, who are still down in this range today? So China's latest figures are, you know, somewhere around 14,000 today. What's going on that's different in terms of income per person? And is it something that can be caught up? So let me put the textbook's got a nice little picture here. It's wearing out on us. One day it's just not going to work, right? So here is here are the countries. As we have innovation and technology, something that can be replicated, right? The things that Americans are enjoying, the latest, greatest game, can they play that in the poorest of South African villages? Can they play those same games that you guys have on your phone? Or does it not travel that far? Can that sort of software and technology get replicated? Now, we are fortunate to have somebody, we have Jonathan. Anybody else from Africa? Yeah, that's right, Emmanuel, right? So, do they have cell phones in rural villages in some places? Do they have phones, smartphones? Do they have even 4G connection in some places in Africa? Yeah, maybe not the most, but even some of the rural areas. I was in rural India, and I got better coverage than I did in my stinking office here in the United States. I mean, it was 4G LTE in the middle of India, nowhere India, like really rural India, and south of Ranchi, a couple hours in Jharkhand. Like right, is that nowhere India?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's happened here is kind of amazing, is that those folks can have the same games to play. So we have the ability for technology to be replicated in different ways than we ever could 50 years ago, is the only point I wanted to make. And so would we expect convergence over time? And so here is an example of Japan, 1960 at 5,500, and they just skyrocketed into the 1980s and really were able to change. And why do we see them catching up with the other countries? And now they've stayed kind of lock, stock, and barrel here with the European and other places as we move through time. Meanwhile, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, Central South America, and the United States. And so why aren't these guys doing that? If they can play Angry Birds in rural Africa and rural India, why aren't they doing that? And instead we see this. that's the type of thing we're going to kind of investigate in this chapter. That's a really interesting question about poverty and about the economy, and what is the secret sauce that allowed the Japanese to rise out relatively quickly and join the more developed countries. And it's not only Japan, they were known as the Asian tigers, so it was Malaysia and Hong Kong and Singapore and some of these other places. What did they do to get up at that level? All right, and so here is those tigers. So 5 Asian countries is what they're showing here. So the main thing is here's China, and here's the other countries that were similar. I mean, Hong Kong maybe and Singapore being the most notable since they are right next to China. Does anybody know the story of Hong Kong and how it's different from mainland China, even though it's Chinese people who occupy and live in the population there? What was it? Yeah. British colony, yeah. So kind of an amazing, what economists call a natural experiment happened. And what happened is that the British said, oh, okay, I get it. This imperialism thing, we were a little rough. You know, we probably shouldn't just take over the world like we did. And so they backed off on the British colonies all over the world. And what they did in China was kind of unique. And they said, listen, we'll let it back, but we're not letting it go back to communism. Like, we're not going to agree to let Hong Kong go if you keep it the way it is. And so what happened is they developed a really strict rule of law in the little island of Hong Kong. And so it was allowed to operate as its own country, essentially, with its own laws. And that's what was set in motion. And then what then happened is, of course, Hong Kong is here now, the blue one. Hong Kong's even higher than the United States in some cases, so right neck and neck with the United States, and China is down here at 55. Notice that scale is not, they're just trying to compress the numbers. It would look more like that other one if we really looked at it, right, in terms of skyrocketing. Look at the scale here. 200, 400, 800, 1600, 5500, and then we go up to 44,000. So don't let that fool you that the numbers are actually really a big distance away when we look at 44,000 versus our Chinese counterparts here somewhere in the 5 to 11 for mainland China. So that's the mystery that we're trying to figure out. Will they eventually catch up as we become more civilized, or however you want to phrase it, as information spreads around the globe, different technologies, how do we farm? You know, oh, the Americans, they figured out some cool machinery. Well, can that machinery be replicated in, you know, Africa and India? Of course it can, right? I mean, those machines, they'll be sold. So in a global economy, we've got resources kind of roaming the globe with entrepreneurs looking for profit. So if there's fertile ground in India, that ground could be purchased. It could be purchased by, some countries might have restrictions on who can buy land or not. So maybe a person in India buys it and then buys the machine from, maybe it's a John Deere tractor or something, right? So this whole idea of globalization, I want you to think a little differently than maybe you've ever thought before, of how it's actually spreading potential knowledge and wealth around the world. And are we going to see results that we tend to converge or not? Are we going to see that prosperity? I'll give you the answer. This is discouraging. I mean, that's a 50-year run. Some countries have done it, some countries haven't. And so that's where the economists can come in and hopefully be helpful in saying, well, how does Hong Kong differ from mainland China's policies, right? What is the difference? What's been the secret sauce? Okay, questions or comments on that? All right. Now, what is kind of scary to some people is to think about the potential of China with the communist regime. What's the population of China? Roughly, not looking for exact numbers. What's the population? What is it? How much?
3 plus billion, maybe.
3 plus billion? No, that's too big. So we got about 8 billion around the globe. It is a little over a billion. 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly. India is actually a little bigger than China. So between China and India, get up to the 3 billion, roughly, almost 3 billion. And the world's population is 8. So think about the concentration of human beings that we have in India and China. And now, if we start to have China grow their economy, what is their potential given the size of the United States relative to the size of China? So how much population do we have in the United States? Roughly again?
500 million.
Too strong on 500 million.
320 million.
320, 350, around that. So China and India are about 4 times the size in terms of population as the United States. So imagine if they figured out the secret sauce, world domination. We all become communists and we worship the Chinese government or something, right? That's kind of the fear that's out there that I think is not right. I don't think that's going to be the thing that crushes us all. Apparently, maybe this virus going around might be something though. They keep the media always has to draw up some drama. But you guys aware of this Cordova virus or what's it called? The coronavirus. I think I just heard this morning that it's confirmed that every state in China or every region, I can't remember what they call themselves exactly in China, but has had a confirmed case with this virus. And so basically, if it starts to go kind of ballistic there, they're trying to like keep people out of schools, and it's kind of turning into one of those TV shows about spreading the thing. Will that ever make it to the United States? Maybe. So there's a lot of people who study that stuff that's a little concerned. So anyway, I'd be more worried about that, I think, than domination of the Chinese. Because part of the way the Chinese are going to grow is through mutual exchange and trade. What we learned from the International Trade Chapter, right? Is that if we can both engage in trade and come up with terms of trade that are basically free from barriers, both countries can be made better off. That means as China prospers, will the United States gain? Yes. So as China wins, Americans will win too. It's a win-win game. So we don't have to have that mentality of, we don't want them to catch up with us because we're going to be the beneficiaries of that to some extent as well. Okay, so have you guys heard of the rule of 70, or sometimes called the rule of 72? Some of you who had my personal finance class, that might ring a bell. So we're going to look at that for a second here. The rule of 70 is the way that this textbook does it. And it's kind of just a neat little relationship about growth rates and whether these guys will catch up. So how the rule of 70 works is that the number of years to double is equal to approximately 70 divided by the rate of growth. The number of years to double, it's just one of these weird mathematical anomalies that 70 divided by the rate of growth gives you the amount of time. So in personal finance class, what we're looking at is, if I invest my money, so example, invest $1,000 at an interest rate. Since we're going to be doing interest rate, by the way, in this class coming up here shortly, so this is good reinforcement. I invest $1,000 at an interest rate of 10%. How long will it take? How long will it take to grow right today, to grow to $2,000. How long will it take my money to double? And the answer is 7 years. That's what's so cool about this little formula. It's a little rule of thumb. So it says if you can invest $1,000 and get 10% on your money, it'll take you 7 years to double it to get 2,000. So the answer is 7. 70 divided by 7. I'm sorry, divided by 10. 70 divided by 10 equals 7 years. That's the rule of 70. And that works for anything, for rainfall, tree growth, any sort of growth rate where there's compounding. That's how it's going to work. Okay, so here's your question. If China is currently at 14,000 per capita income at YPC for China of $14,000 per person. If China's currently at 14,000 per person and the per capita income of the USA is equal to 63,000, with China growing at 10% and the USA having economic growth at 2%. So China's got 14,000, US has got 63, China's growing at 10%, US is growing at 2%. How long will it take China to catch up to the USA? You're not gonna nail the answer right on the head. You can estimate. So as soon as you get an answer, let me know, and I'll give you some extra credit if you're right. So first person to yell out the answer that's at least roughly close. You got an answer? 19 years. Okay. So go ahead. You guys keep working. What's your name again? Tyler. Tyler. 19 years. So if you get a different answer than Tyler, yell it out, because I'll go to second place. If Tyler's like, if he's wrong, then I'll go to the next person. That's in the close enough ballpark?
Yeah.
So you're seconding that. You think it's about 19 years. Okay, now, did you guys take into account, I'll give you a hint, that the United States is going to be higher in that time frame too, because they are growing as well.
Yeah.
So make sure you kind of thought about that. I want to see if I can find this awesome little video that I lost at some point. 21. Okay, yeah, if it's closer, we gotta. We'll see. I don't know if how close I'll be able to get. We'll see if this link works. Oh, sweet, it does. Okay, I lost this one for a while. I haven't been able to play this one for a while. Okay, while you guys are calculating, I got just a 1-minute video here. This is what people are afraid of, right? Beijing, China, 2030. Here we go.
为什么强大的国家都会走向灭亡呢？古希腊、罗马、被编定，美国，因为他们都犯同样错误，与原来四方成功的原则背道而驰。美国政府企图以庞大的开支和税收来摆脱严重的经济衰退。 聚合着所谓刺激开支庞大的医疗改革，政府接管私有企业，债务累累。当然，我们是他们的大债之主。现在他们都得给我们干活。
Washington spending is bankrupting America.
Ooh,
Citizens have
scary.
to change our future.
All right. I just kind of like that because that's people's fear. That's really not right. So that's what you guys are going to be a cut above the average American who might be afraid of that. All right. So I heard 21. Who said 21? Sean. All right. Joint effort. Well, we'll get to that later if you win. Anybody else on there? Okay. So let's kind of do it together here. What I like to do is kind of set up a timeline almost. So China's doubling how often? Every 7 years. So if we go kind of 7, 14, 21, right? So this is 7, 14, 21. So we're kind of measuring time as we go this way. 28. If they double it again, they get 56. If they double it again, 112. Everybody with me so far on that? See what we did? We just kind of doubled it each time. And then the United States here at 63,000. How long does it take them to double? 35. So now this is where it gets a little tricky here. So 28, and then another 7 gets us out to 35, right? So for the United States, they go from 63 to 126 out here. So after 21 years, you guys said they're here. So where's the halfway mark here? 63, 26, so 30 something, right? If we were somewhere in here, is this where you guys are saying? So what are we at here at the midway point? If we're working our way up to 126, we're currently at 63. That's about 31 and a half, 30. 1 and a half, let's call it 32 plus 63 is 95, 94, right? So 94 at the what point? The 17 mark, where I don't know where that tick is. So what are we at here? 90 something? 93, 94. Okay, so they haven't caught up there yet, right? So now between here and here, where do they catch up? So when do we hit 112? What are we at this? What are we at the Ashan 21? That's probably the key question here to try to estimate. 99,900. Okay. So what do we got here? 30 years or so to go. 30 years in the in that time frame. So are we over here more? I see lots of blank stares up.
In the middle of that.
Who do you think's better, Ashan or Tyler? Sean. So we got 94, 126. Okay, it's not really that important. Let's give extra credit to both of them. You guys are close enough. How about that? I'm feeling generous today. So on a test or something, I will give you a question like that, but it'll probably have a little bit easier answers where you won't have to do that. So you should note, does anybody have any questions on what we did there about the doubling, right? You got that? If you have that, that's kind of the most important thing of when we get caught up. So now the tough part is, Ashan, I heard your voice first. You were kind of claiming that there was some sort of sharing arrangement. So you own the point. I have well-defined property rights. This is econ class. So well-defined property rights. I just want to make sure you're clear that you own this point. However, this particular point, not all points, but this particular point with extra credit is transferable. So we can create a market for extra credit points. Now I'm the government, so I'm going to restrict your ability to transfer points, but you have the ability, as government, I'm going to allow you to transfer points here if you choose to do so. You can also sell them. So 1 point, yeah, maybe you could sell it to her for $1 or something. I don't know. So it does create a market. You own it. You can sell it. Tyler over there, he's got his locked down. So Tyler, what's your last name? With a G? Okay, Tyler G. +1. Ashan, what would you like to do? What's your decision? Keep it. All right. So Ashan is keeping it. He's ruthless. No charity. Watch out when he hits the business world. He will steal like the Chinese do the intellectual property. Intellectual property was obviously shared here, and potentially stolen. I'm not going to do a full investigation, but that's what we're talking about here with this material. Okay. So that's the rule of 70, and that is how they could potentially catch us. That's the idea. So the next piece we want to look at is the labor market. So I'm gonna kind of step back a moment and kind of foreshadow where we're going with the next 4 chapters, basically, of the book. So we will build a 4-market model of the economy, of macroeconomics. Gosh, I cannot write today. My brain's going faster than my pen. Macroeconomics. All right. So what I want you to do, and I know some of you haven't had micro, so this is going to be completely foreign, but do it anyway. So on your papers, draw 4 graphs. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 graphs. So we're currently in chapter 23. So chapter 23, we're going to have the labor market. So we're going to have a kind of supply. I'm going to leave it real general at this point so we don't freak out too much. But we're going to talk about the labor market. And we're going to be measuring labor hours on the horizontal axis and wages over here. So all of chapter 23 is looking at that. This week, the other chapter we're going to cover is chapter 24. And 24 is chapter 24 is the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market. So this is going to talk about saving and investing. Let's put investing in capital, which we use the letter K, kind of named after Karl Marx. Das Kapital was a K for capital. So saving and investing, buying machines, the financial markets, stuff like that. We're not going to talk really about the stock market per se, except a little bit on the side on some things. But we're talking a bigger picture than that. It goes beyond the stock market for what we're looking at in terms of businesses buying machines to help make other stuff. And then, of course, households tucking away their money in some savings. So that's called the loanable funds market, where we'll be going this week. And then down here, we have chapter 25 is the money market. Money market. And we're going to be talking about, currency and money supply. Money supply and demand. That's next week's material. It's actually only one chapter that week because that's kind of a big week. So one chapter of material next week, talking about the money market. And then we kind of get to the granddaddy of them all here. Chapter 26 will be the following week. So we got kind of 3 weeks worth of material of building this. And this is called the goods market. So what we're measuring here is real GDP and the price level, our two biggies. The quantities of all goods and services, the prices of all goods and services. We're going to kind of master that together in a supply and demand framework to hopefully gain some insights. So that's where I'm taking you on this journey. Starting today, we're getting into this, but this is where we're heading to try to put the big pieces of the puzzle together for the class and thinking about the macro economy. As long as I'm on that, I think it might be helpful. This is why, if you have this, I'd like you to bring a copy of it to class. We'll kind of always come back to this picture. So let me walk you through here. This is kind of where we left off. We talked about the government entering the picture of the final goods and services and the resource market. Then we opened up the world to China and some other places, the rest of the world with imports and exports. We got our gross domestic product of C plus I plus G plus X, cigarettes equals income. So our expenditure approach said C plus I plus G plus X equals the amount of income for our nation, GDP. And then here's the one we haven't gone through yet. This is the full plate of spaghetti. So the full plate of spaghetti is what we're going to get into this week. That's why I wanted to show it to you, this market. Now we're going to give the opportunities for these guys to either buy American goods, buy Chinese goods, or save their money. So if they save their money, they're going to go into the financial system, the financial markets. And then ultimately that leads to these guys being able to borrow some money, and then that's part of the picture. So this picture is one way to kind of think about it, to try to keep a bunch of moving parts together, and then we're going to support it with this framework as we work through the next 3 weeks. Okay, questions or comments there? All right, so for this piece, I want to think about the relationship between inputs and outputs. So we're going to look at what we call the production function. So production function. Production function. You guys remember that song from Sesame Street or something? I think it was actually conjunction function or something, but I think what's that? He did. The guy who wrote it, or the singer that sang it? Wow, yeah. So it's amazing how many years that's kept. So this is the production function, though. And so what we're thinking about is how inputs are transferred into output. And at this macro level now, we can think about. In fact, let me kind of maybe play into this a little bit here. So let's think about pizza. I probably could do the round pizza, but here's a pizza with different sausage and pepperoni and whatever. Okay, so there's our pizza. What goes into making a pizza here? What are some of the stuff that goes into making a pizza here if you work at one of the companies? Sauce, cheese, sauce, cheese. What else to bring it to your plate? Grease. Grease. So cheese, grease, grease. Yeah. Dough, bread. Okay, let's get off of the physical stuff. You're going to go to pizza time tonight and eat dinner. What else brings kind of the finished product of eating pizza at pizza time in Main Street, Ottawa. What else do we need? Service. We need people, right? We need labor.
Table.
Table. We need a table to sit at. We've got a building. We got the oven. Okay, you guys get the picture. That's probably good, right? So the business owner has figured out how to organize these resources and transform it magically. It just comes to your plate as a finished pizza ready to eat, right? You don't understand what all went into this, all the coordination, all the plans, the hiring, the firing, the setting the schedules. Now you do that, so you work at Pizza Time, don't you? Okay, so Austin is our Pizza Time expert. So some people might know it more than others, but that is a production function. I didn't talk about dollars here at all, is my main point. These are all quantities, quantity of resources leading to a quantity of output. And so the general economy, we're going to kind of characterize that as output is a function of labor and capital. Ooh, I just kind of slipped right in there into a math function, didn't I? So this is a generic way to write a mathematical formula. And how we interpret this is we say output, which in our case we're going to say is real GDP, right? So if we start thinking about the nation, we can think about what drives our output, what drives our GDP. Well, it's a function of, so this little piece equals with a little f, output is a function of the things in the brackets. And the brackets is saying some combination of labor and capital. Some combination of labor and capital. And then we could get more fancy and put other resources, but I'm just going to put L and K to simplify things, and this is what your textbook does too. Okay, so there's the equation that would have, if we had a little more detail, it might be something weird like, L squared plus 4HK, whatever, some sort of long formula. This is just the generic way of writing a formula. So let's kind of write that down. So this is the generalized method to show formula. We could get more specific if there was actually a functional form, y equals 35 times L plus 4K plus 6KL plus K squared times L squared. I just totally made that up. But that's what you see in your college algebra class, right? Or in algebra, some sort of specific functional form, which then would allow you to say, oh, well, if L equals 10 and K equals 3, I could shove it into that formula and out pops a number. So 10 units of labor and 3 units of capital is going to give me 100 units of pizza, right? That's all we're kind of saying. This part, you may have a few homework problems that might have some specific stuff. We don't rely on that too much, but I just kind of want to give you that background intuition as we go through. Okay, questions on that at all? All right. What does this graph out to be? So we will pay attention a lot to graphical stuff. So with this one now, let's put labor on the horizontal axis and real GDP on the vertical axis. Not knowing what the functional form is, do you suspect this sucker looks like this, this, or this? A, B, or C? Which one do you suspect it looks like? A, B, or C?
B.
B. So 10 units of labor, B is a straight line, right? So a linear relationship. So if we did the rise over the run business, and it turned out like, let's say this was 10 and this was 30, then it's constant along that. I add 10 people, I get 30 more pizzas. I add 10 people, I get 30 more pizzas. So B is Bryce's selection. Does everybody agree with that? You say C. I see some other people. C or A? C?
Law of diminishing returns.
Law of diminishing returns. Bingo. Okay, so if you had micro before, remember that law? We've got a little law kicking in, and that's what we need to recognize here, is that it's likely going to be C. In fact, the real production function might actually be a combination of all these things. I'm going to do a short little illustration that those in the micro have seen, but I'm not going to do the full table of numbers for you. But C ends up being the one that exhibits the law of diminishing. You said return, so I'm going to write that, but it's also equivalent to the law of diminishing marginal product. The law of diminishing marginal product is what C is showing. Here's my example I like to run through because I used to work in a restaurant. My first job, I started off as a dishwasher, and then like 2 months later, I was cooking hamburgers. So imagine that this tabletop here, this tabletop is my grill at the restaurant. And Russ can make 100 hamburgers on his shift, right? So I can produce 100 hamburgers. One Russ equals 100 hamburgers. So my question to you is, if I add a second person to the production, will output hamburgers go up to 200, produce greater than 200, or a little less than 200? Everybody with me? So I got Russ all by himself makes 100 hamburgers. If I add 2 people, will production climb to 200, more than 200, or less than 200? 200, less than 200? Depends on what? The worker, yeah. So it does. So I'm going to hold that constant because that's what us economists do. We're going to assume away some problems. So let's assume that Russ has been genetically engineered and we have a cloned Russ. Equal skill, equal ability. So now my second worker is simply a second Russ. Does it climb from 100 to 200, 100 to more than 200, or 100 to less than 200? Jake?
I think it's more, but like, there's so many burgers you can put up.
Okay, so why would it be, let me just go back to your thing where you kind of like, you sound conflicted, like there's an internal story that's just battling it out in your heart. So what, the first part you said, you think it would be more, why?
It's like if one Russ is cooking all the burgers, another Russ could be like making like some lettuce.
Okay, good, and that's right. So could we have some specialization? So in Adam Smith's book, Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations, one of his big contributions there was the notion of specialization. So it's possible that as economies grow, there might be certain tasks that can be specialized. And so if I add the second Russ, even though the first Russ could only do 100, Russ number 1 had to do all the hamburger, right? We had to patty up the burgers, fry them, grill the buns, do the plate setups, the tomato, the onion, whatever, get the plate set up, right? Russ number 1 had to do that all. Maybe with a second Russ, one Russ could do all the patties and the grilling, the other one could do the plate setups, right? So we could have specialization, which then would lead to more than 200 hamburgers being possible with 2 Russes. Okay, so now, everybody got that idea?
Yeah.
So what would that look like, by the way, A, B, or C? What graph? A. So that idea of 1 Russ does 100, 2 Russes can do more than 200 is reflecting A. Rust number 3. More specialization?
Yeah.
Maybe. Rust number 4. Rust number 5. Rust number 6. Rust number 7. Rust number 8. Rust number 23. Can we agree that if there's 23, if I ask 23 of you to come up to this, would the 23rd rust actually be able to touch the grill? Probably not, right? And so eventually, we call it a law because it's inevitable. As you add more and more of a variable resource, like labor, to at least one fixed resource, the grill top, the productivity of the additional resources, the extra russes, will eventually diminish, which is capturing C. Extra russes are not adding as much as the early russes. If I was to kind of even take my kind of sloppy graph here and say 1, 2, 3, the first rus gave me 100 units of hamburgers. The second rus only brought in, and I'm not talking about the story I just said. I'm saying if we were following diminishing returns, so I might be on the 7th or 8th rus. If the second person makes it climb to 140, then the product made by the second person is actually incrementally 40, right? Which is this rectangle. If we were kind of doing this graphically, the area of this rectangle is 1 times 100 is 100. The area of this rectangle is 1 times 40 is 40. And the third rus now, coming here, might get us up to 150. And so we're only getting 10 extra hamburgers. So that graph C is reflecting the law of diminishing returns or the law of diminishing marginal product. One of the top 3, I would say, in economics, the law of diminishing marginal product. Okay, so that, I spent a little more time in micro class, but for this class we don't need to spend much more time, but that's kind of the justification of why we'd see at the macro level that same thing holding, because it holds at the micro level with Russ and a hamburger shop. Then what does it look like at the macro level where we have all goods and services? So this is how we draw the production function, where we're measuring Y and labor. When we draw a 2-dimensional graph, inevitably what we're doing is we're holding capital constant. So this is a real important point here. So if I move from point A to B, I've added another rus holding the grill constant. So along a 2-dimensional production function here, capital is constant. Along the single production function, capital is constant. And that's this diminishing returns. And at the macro level, even as I add more human beings, in general, we'd expect that shape to hold as well, given that we have a limited amount of machines and buildings and infrastructure around for additional human beings to work on. There's going to be a process there. That said, what happens if we get another grill? What happens if we do get another machines? What happens to this function graphically? It shifts up. So now, with additional machines, 2 russes, or let's just call it this level of labor, they used to be able to only make, and I'm just going to make the numbers a lot bigger here, so 1,000 units, and this was at 20 units of labor. So at 20 units of labor, we used to do 1,000 units of output, but now we can do more. With more machines, even with this unit of labor, we could have done more. And so this whole thing shifts up to, let's call it Y2, where K2 is greater than K1. Let's go ahead and sneak in a little 1 down here. K1 was constant, but now it's something higher at this greater level of machines. So, key point here is an increase in capital shifts the function, production function, up. What about technology changing? So we have the same amount of machines, but there's a new information that allows us to take the same resources, combining them differently. We have an innovation, a change in technology. What would happen to this thing? If here we are here, what would happen if there's a change in technology? At each level, you're getting into the interaction that I'm going to show in a little bit. But what would happen to this function if there was a change in technology? Shift up or down, like would labor become more able to do stuff in general? Here's where it gets kind of funny. You guys are thinking a little bit about, oh, now we don't need as many Russes because of new technology, there's a robot behind the grill, okay? Don't think about it that way. Think about the macroeconomy, that we have some things emerging. And so if we have a new technology that even does replace Russ, let me put a big smiley face because it's like, oh, I'm sad, I lost my job, right? So new technology replaces Russ, but in the macroeconomy, thinking long-term, this chapter's long-term growth, what's unhappy Russ going to do? Go get another job at some other place that is, that have maybe get retrained to use it, whatever the case is. But that person's going to do something different. And so the remaining Russes at that particular company are more productive. One person can do more than what they could before because of the new technology. And the unhappy Russ is going to go to some other industry and get employed anyway. And so ultimately, this thing's shifting up just like it did with new machines. So a technological advance is going to push that thing up just like it did by adding more machines. Okay, so all of this kind of ties into what we did in chapter 2. This is how the material starts to build on each other. In chapter 2, we had the production possibilities frontier, the PPF. And in the PPF, we had, let's say, beer and pizza, right? Beer and pizza were just 2 of the millions of goods we have in GDP. GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of the year. All the stuff we do is how many trillions in the United States, roughly? Just to kind of get a ballpark of this, it's in the trillions. I'll give you a hint. 100 trillion, 1 trillion, 50 trillion, 1,000 trillion. That's getting really big. 12 trillion, a little higher than that.
17.
The GDP for the United States, about 20. 20 is kind of the one to kind of keep off the top of your head. So roughly, let's call it $20 trillion worth of stuff. The chapter 2, I just want to kind of call to your attention, was just beer and pizza. It's like 2 things out of a zillion things, right? But we can start to kind of think about consumption goods. This could be, and you guys might have saw one of your homework problems even. So consumption goods, where we're talking, let's put pizza over here, beer, pizza, and eating things. And then instead of measuring pizza, let's put capital. So machines, computers, buildings, right? All the stuff we call capital. So we're making choices as Americans. Are we at point A where we're more machines and less beer and pizza? Or are we at a point like B where we got more beer and pizza and less machines, right? We're making those choices. over the course of a year on what the composition of our capital base is going to be. Do we got more tractors and stuff, or do we have more beer and pizza that we pooped out from the previous day? Right? Those are important choices we're making at the micro level that ultimately add up and aggregate up to the macro level. So, how do we get economic growth? If there's more machines, and you guys said this happens, what happened with more machines here? It shifted out. Now, here's the thing. The machines might have been a shift out like this, possibly. So since we're measuring machines here, it shifted out. But more machines allowed me to get from point A to get to point, let's call it C, right? So I could have more beer and pizza and more machines. Or I could even be here. I could be anywhere along that orange line where I have more beer and pizza than what I did before, right? So technological advance, more machines, more equipment, that is economic growth. So from the production possibilities frontier, economic growth is a shift outward of the production possibilities frontier. So this is more of just to kind of connect the dots from what we did in chapter 2, and we did a little bit in chapter 7, thinking about the production possibilities frontier internationally. Now this picture is connected to that picture. Right? So we're pushing out the frontier of material things potentially and other things. Okay, questions on that so far? All right, so let's get to this market. This is where we wanted to get to. Is knowing this information, how does the demand and supply of labor get determined? If each additional Russ, if the 23rd Russ doesn't add as much hamburgers, if the third Russ adds 10 hamburgers versus the first Russ, how much can I pay additional Russes compared to previous Russes? Which one can I afford to pay more, the first Russ or the 23rd Russ? The first Russ. But wait, fair wages equal pay for everybody. Crap, we're even talking about identical, human being for that matter, that's genetically coded to be identical, right? So the point is there's a difference between what we're actually paying our labor and what we can afford to pay our labor, right? So the law of diminishing returns teaches us that as employers hire more and more people with a fixed amount of grill space, they're not able to afford to pay as much for the last person hired compared to the first person hired, even if those people are identical human beings, right? The law of diminishing returns kicks in and forces us to have a downward sloping demand for labor. So, as we now start to model labor hours, which this is one thing to keep in mind. Sometimes I'll go back and forth between actual human beings and the hours that those human beings are put in. The unemployment rate deals with actual numbers of human beings, whereas here now we're measuring the number of hours that are being worked in the economy. So if I'm measuring wages here, so money paid, and we think about how much would employers be willing to pay for the first people? Well, the first people are really productive, so I could afford to pay them more. And the last people hired, I can't pay as much. And so long story short, we spend a little more time in micro class on this, but for this class, we have this downward sloping labor demand curve.
Isn't that just also attached to
LD.
Isn't it also attached to experience? So like if they're longer, then they're likely to get paid more.
Yeah, so we're kind of ignoring those things for this analysis because this is really top level when we're thinking about all the hours worked. But conceptually, the microeconomic foundations of that, it's still the same. That if I hire extra people, and then there might be other dynamics with seniority or cultural influences that cause us to have differential pays for some people than others. So we're taking baby steps here as we go through. It's good to think about some of the real world stuff, and remember that we're building an economic model. I don't think I've told my General Lee story here yet. Some of you may have heard this from Micro, but when my economics professor, when I was in your guys' chair back in 1989, maybe it was 1990, whatever, he'd say the word economic model, I'd be like, all I could think about was when I was a young boy, I had the Dukes of Hazzard. You guys watch the Dukes of Hazzard at all?
Yeah.
Or you've seen the movie, and it's been kind of remade. Well, the General Lee was that car, right? Which was the Dodge Charger. And that was the car. And so I had one of those models. It was a model car. And so I was trying to connect the dots with like, okay, economic model versus a model car. And it's like, well, they can't be related. Turns out, after more reflection, I think they are related to each other. And here's how. So I know that my little model car is not the real General Lee, right? I know that the model car is not the real General Lee. But if it's all done proportionately, like models are, it gives me proportionately what the General Lee looks like. Even if you pop open the little hood, it shows a V8 engine in there and kind of what an engine looks like. It's got the tires, it's got the color of the car, right? All the stuff is there of what the real car looks like, even though I don't know, I know that this isn't the real car. Well, an economic model in that respect is kind of the same thing. The real world is very complex. Would you guys agree with that? I mean, the world is complex. And so what an economic model does is it says, it's almost, I like to describe it as almost chaotic. Like if you guys just silence yourself right now and try to imagine the number of transactions that are going on in Ottawa, just our little town of Ottawa. How many times is the cash register being rung up right now at all of our local businesses on Main Street, Walmart, Price Chopper? You can almost hear the cash register going, right? That's just in our little town. The number of economic transactions that are going on. Then we say Franklin County. Then we say the state of Kansas. Then we say the United States, and let alone the world. It's mind-blowing to think about the economy, so to speak, in terms of the transactions that are going on. So what does an economist do? We know that the real world is crazy and probably pretty hard to describe in general. Can we fix some things and say, let me pull down like 4 to 5 things into this artificial environment like this, kind of an artificial environment, and say, okay, now if this one moves, what happens to this one, right? And so that's how we're using the economic model to hopefully gain insights about how the real world that's so complex works. By taking these little steps and saying, can I observe some relationships? Are there some laws that hold that I can make predictions now about how one thing relates to the other thing? And I argue you can do that. That's exactly what we're doing. So it's like we're building this artificial environment. We know it's not the real world, but can we gain some insights about the real world? And I say absolutely. Similar to what we do with a little model car. Okay, labor demand. So this thing is downward sloping. So labor demand kind of shows the quantity of labor hours demanded at various real wages. We'll get to the real wages part in a bit, but I want your definition to be good. Shows the quantity of labor hours demanded at various real wages given the capital stock. Now we're kind of talking, since this is Macrocast, the capital stock of the country, and technology. That is how we wrote this production possibilities frontier. The production possibilities frontier was the combination of two goods an economy can produce given its available resources and technology. So it's exactly how we wrote that. How does it shift? More resources, more technology. Now that's going to be a shifter over here. Is that if there's more resources, it's going to shift. So let's go ahead and write labor demand shifters right below this. An increase in capital or quantity of other resources leads to an increase in labor demand, a shift to the right. So I brought my golf club today so that we can start to visualize some of this stuff. So if there's an increase in capital, this shifts to the right. If there's an increase in technology, it shifts to the right. So we're thinking kind of right and left with these shifts. So that's number one. Number two, if there's an increase in technology, that will lead to an increase in labor demand, a shift to the right. So I put this here, up arrow, labor demand means shift right. Now I'm not going to write that anymore. So it's a shift to the right if there's a change in technology. Okay, questions on labor demand? All right. Who supplies labor? Where does the supply of labor come from in a nation? It's population, right. So if we think back to our picture, I'm not going to drop the screen on you here, but just as a quick maybe mental reference here. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. All of the resources are owned by people, real human beings over here, households, and they are selling the resources to businesses in exchange for payments. That's our resource market. So the supply of labor comes from households. Labor supply. LS. So what's a little bit weird with this market compared to maybe the final goods market is that the supply curve is households and the demand curve is businesses. Businesses want to buy labor and households want to supply it so that they can go out and buy stuff. So labor supply shows the quantity of labor supplied by households, shows the quantity of labor supplied by households at various real wages given the size of the labor force. So there's one of our early introductions into previous chapters material, sneaking its way back into this stuff. So we had the working age population, the WAP. the working age population. How old did you have to be a member of the working age population according to how the government defines it? 16 ages or older, right? The working age population. So if there's an increase in the WAP, if the working age population increases, what happens to the supply curve?
Shifts up.
So do you think it would go up or to the right? So let's kind of think about how this thing works again. At $18 an hour, we'd have this many people wanting to work. Let's say 1,000 hours of work. So this many people want to get off the couch and go to work if they can get $18 an hour. If we're at $16 an hour, less people are willing to get off the couch and go to work. Maybe it's 800. So if the population grows, though, would there be more or less people? So as the WAP is at the current population, let's call it WAP number 1. So the working age population is, just pick out a number, 160 million people. So what would happen now if there was 180 million people? Would it shift to the right or to the left at $18? Would there be more people willing to work or less people? More, right? So at 18, there used to be 1,000, but now there's more. At 16, there used to be 800, but now there's more. At $7 an hour, there used to be this many people, but now there's more. And so the whole thing, the labor supply curve at WAP number 2, shifts to the right. All right, so now you already start to see the interaction going on here, right? If the population grows, what happens to wages? Do they go up or down? They go down. So if the population grows, holding all other things constant, they go down. If, though, there's a technological advance and more machines, the labor demand curve could go up here. So if that happens, we might move from here's where we were in history in 1999, and here's where we are in 2004, right? So technological advance outpaced population growth, causing us to have actual higher wages, which brings us back to what we started with, real GDP per person, more income per person. Where does that come from? From these dynamics. We'll pick up there on Wednesday.